with the screen share. It is 9:55 a.m. on Friday, July 31st. Wait, is it July 31st? And
wait, can you mute Heather?
Yeah, there we go. All right, it is February. I'm going to give Sunstone a chance to edit out some bad sound. Good morning, and thank you for attending the 2020 Sunstone Digital Symposium, session 226, titled How Hearts Are Changed, Learning to Affirm LGBTQ Journeys. The audio from this session will be available for purchase at sunstone.org after the symposium. The video recording of this session will be available for purchase at at the Whova app for the remainder of 2020. Q&A will happen interspersed throughout the session. So feed your questions and I will feed them to the panelists during the discussion. At Sunstone, we are making it a goal to build a community that allows many ways for people to express their faith. Our tagline is, quote, "There is more than one way to Mormon." We invite you to help us build a community where all paths are given space to be better understood. Please support us in our mission by making a donation and subscribing at sunstone.org. About this presentation, many Latter-day Saints are filled with fear and uncertainty when they learn that they or their loved ones are LGBTQ. In this session, the presenters will share how they're learning to embrace and affirm themselves and their LGBTQ family and friends. Where they once felt grief, they now feel peace. They are learning to sit with the complexity of LGBTQ acceptance while participating in a church whose core theology is structured around heteronormative ideas and defined gender roles. They have found gratitude in this journey and consider it a blessing. I'll take a second to introduce you to our speakers before we begin. Christina D. is a moderator of the Mormons Building Bridges Facebook group. She is a married mother of 2 and loves learning, reading, journaling, meal prepping, creating with her kids, volunteering, and connecting with friends. Chris Irvin is a trans-masculine, non-binary person who has a husband of 13 years named Nate and a 12-year-old son named Toby, who is already an awesome ally to queer people. Chris is passionate about raising awareness for transgender people, especially youth, and is known as Twitter's possum parent, because they try to lift and carry the queer community like a possum carrying its young. Heather Robertson. Heather Robertson is a mom to 3 strong, brave, and entertaining children and a mother-in-law to 1 more. In the spring of 2019, her youngest came out as gay and challenged everything she'd ever believed about the LGBTQ+ community. She and her husband, Matt, have lived in 5 different states and currently reside in Mill Creek, Utah. Heather enjoys running, hiking, playing games with her family, and making new friends. I will now give the floor to our presenters. Let me unmute them and let me start the video for them. And Chris is not here yet. If Chris doesn't come for her part of the, or for their part of the presentation, I apologize, Chris. Then I am a transgender woman and I'm fully qualified to speak to those issues. I'm not qualified to speak on Chris's story, but the other panelists have agreed that if they can't make it, if Chris can't make it, that I'll go ahead and join in on the trans part. I'm going to mute my audio because I have kids in the background that are having a fun morning, and I'm going to turn the time over to you guys.
All right, thank you, Kimberly. I just want to share a little bit about my journey, and then I'm going to talk about how people can shift their views regarding LGBTQ issues. So 20 years ago, my good friend Travis told me that he was gay. He talked about his journey of dating girls and serving a Latter-day Saint mission, hoping it would change his orientation. Sorry, I think we still have some feedback. Heather, are you able to mute? Oh, thank you. Okay, so my friend Travis came out to me and told me he was gay, And he talked about his journey of dating girls and serving a mission, hoping it would change his orientation. Because like so many, he thought that if he was righteous and obedient and followed all the commandments, that somehow God would bless him and make him attracted to girls. When he realized that his attractions weren't going away, he decided to come out to family and friends. And this was a very lonely time for him. There weren't many resources available, and I think he only knew one other person who was gay. He felt a lot of shame for who he was, and there are many times that he thought about suicide. He eventually met a man named Chris, and he was dating him for a few months when he came out to me. He said he hoped that we could still be friends and that I shouldn't try to change him. I told him that I love him and I'll always be there for him. A couple of days later, I wrote in my journal, just trying to process my feelings. This is some of what I wrote. Travis told me he is gay. He is also pursuing the gay lifestyle. I know he was born with these feelings and has fought his attractions to men for several years, but I don't believe God approves of his choices. However, I will always love him, and I want to remain his friend. Over the years, I kept in touch with Travis, and I made a few more friends who are LGBTQ. I was really sympathetic to all of their situations, but I still felt firm in my beliefs. In fact, in June of 2015, when non-heterosexual marriage became legal in the United States, I was absolutely convinced that it was a ploy of the adversary to destroy the family. On November 5th of that same year, there was a letter that was sent to Latter-day Saint church leaders outlining changes to the church handbook. A new policy was added that banned children of parents in non-heterosexual marriages from receiving saving ordinances. And it also characterized these marriages as apostasy. In the days and weeks that followed, I spent a lot of time processing this policy, and I really tried to make sense of it. And I honestly had such a hard time when I logged into social media and I saw so many of my friends defending it. After praying about it for several weeks, I received a distinct impression to learn more about the LGBTQ experience. So I listened to podcasts and read several books from LGBTQ authors. And I also started volunteering with many LGBTQ organizations. As I listened to the stories of our LGBTQ siblings with an open heart, I started to have a paradigm shift. I learned that many of them were very prayerful about their decisions to enter into non-heterosexual relationships or to transition to the gender that is correct for them. This was a very powerful insight. I had wrongly assumed that they just did not want God in their lives. Once I had the realization that many of them have a very intimate relationship with God, I started viewing LGBTQ issues as a matter of diversity and humanity rather than issues rooted in morality. Humans in general have always struggled with those who are different from the majority. I think God wants us to learn how to love people fully without assuming that we know what the best path for them is. Many religions they place value in a faith that is based in knowledge and conviction. We see this in the Latter-day Saint tradition when children go up to the pulpit and bear their testimony. They start out with, I want to bear my testimony and I know the church is true. American novelist Anne Lamott has said, the opposite of faith is not doubt, but certainty. The book, The Sin of Certainty by Peter Enns, also discusses this concept in more detail. I feel such a doctrine or a tension between our doctrine and my feelings for our LGBTQ siblings. When it comes to teaching about their eternal welfare, I personally would love to see an acknowledgement that we don't have all the answers. Currently, the church teaches with certainty that if they choose a path outside of church doctrine, that they won't be in the highest kingdom in the eternities. And I know this teaching instills fear in the hearts of many parents of LGBTQ children and in the children themselves. They worry that they won't be together in heaven. And I lost my place. Sorry. Okay, so I believe that God is much more expansive and inclusive than what we are currently taught. I would also love to see a focus on honoring the personal revelation of each individual. Some members are prompted to follow the covenant path, while others may find more peace and wholeness on a path outside of church teachings. I think both of these paths need to be respected. So my friend Travis and his beloved Chris have been together for 20 years, and they got married at the beginning of this year. When I heard the news, I felt so much joy and celebration for their marriage. I no longer fear for their futures or their well-being. Now I'm going to start my slide presentation. Okay, so I want to talk about different ways that people learn to see these issues in a new light. In the early 1970s, a psychologist named Dorothy Riddle developed the Riddle scale, which is a psychometric scale that measures the degree of homophobia that exists or doesn't exist in an individual. I like how this particular graph talks about family diversity rather than just relating to homosexuality, because I want to focus on the LGBTQ spectrum as a whole. At the low end of the scale is repulsion. This is where LGBTQ people are considered to be immoral, sick, and wicked. Anything is justified to change them, whether it be hospitalization or conversion therapy. Pity is where anyone who is LGBTQ is pitied and not looked at as the ideal. Becoming the ideal should be reinforced. And this could be due to religious teachings that being LGBTQ is a trial of this life only. And I will just talk about a couple more of these. Here at Admiration, this acknowledges that being LGBTQ in our society takes strength. And at the end, Nurturance assumes that LGBTQ people are indispensable in our society. People are willing to be their allies and their advocates. So how does someone move from a lower level to a higher level on this scale? And before I discuss this, I want to emphasize that there are several levels. Just because someone has made a change and moved higher on the scale does not mean that they have arrived at full nurturance. Current church teachings say that we need to love LGBTQ people, but to not condone their choices if they go against doctrine. And a lot of people view this as a very loving thing to do. And Latter-day Saints in general are very loving and have desires to do the right thing. However, I want to point out that this viewpoint still is only somewhere on the middle of the scale. In January of this year, there was a questions posted on the Mormons Building Bridges Facebook page. Mormons Building Bridges is a ministry whose goal it is to make our congregations more welcoming to those who are LGBTQ. And this was the question: what led you to change your beliefs about LGBTQ plus people? There were over 80 responses. A vast majority of people said they have a child, a loved one, or an associate who came out as LGBTQ. And I will just read a couple of those quotes. It was no longer an us versus them issue. It was an issue inside my own house since I have a gay child. It took having a transgender child for me to see the suffering he endured by church teachings. Having LGBTQ coworkers and listening to their pain about Prop 8 was eye-opening for me. Basically, people learn that LGBTQ people are their children, their friends, their neighbors, and their coworkers. They're not just some abstract group that we learn about at church or watch on the news. Some people who responded happened to be LGBTQ themselves. And this is what a couple of people wrote. I am a gay man, and some very affirming friends helped me realize I was not broken or flawed. My best friend told me she was a lesbian. I pegged her as a sinful and terrible person. A few years later, I discovered that I was possibly a lesbian as well. It caused me to do a lot of soul searching. Now, only a couple of people mentioned that looking at data of spiritual trauma of LGBTQ people caused them to see things differently. Dr. Brian Simmons wrote his dissertation on spiritual trauma in LGBTQ adults. He surveyed 278 people who are Mormon or were Mormon. 65% of the respondents consider themselves active in the church, and 31% of them hold temple recommends. This is a graph of some of his findings. There are 21 sayings listed here that are either taught in the church or were said, by a church leader. The squares that are highlighted in blue show that these teachings were beneficial. The squares in pink and purple show that they were damaging. Notice how all of these squares are either pink or purple. And I think it's very telling that the fruits of these teachings do cause trauma. His paper is online for anyone who would like to read it. So for those who have recognized that church teachings about LGBTQ people can cause harm, what can we do about it? And is it possible to hope for change? I asked this question to my friend Derek Knox. He is a gay man who joined the church in 2015. He said that in order to examine this question, we need to change the focus from having empathy for LGBTQ people to examining why these teachings are still in place. Orthodox Latter-day Saints view them as God's eternal, unchanging laws, so they believe that these teachings will always remain. However, I know this audience is more nuanced, so I do want to explore this question. So this is what I posted in the Mormons Building Bridges Facebook group. If you were someone who once believed that LGBTQ identities and lifestyles were sinful and wicked, what was the benefit to you for having that belief? For a person, organization, or system to accept and keep policies in place that can harm LGBTQ folks, there has to be some sort of benefit for them. And these were some of the responses that were shared. I had a huge sense of comfort that the brethren had all the answers, and I didn't have to struggle to figure them out for myself. If LGBTQ people were hurting from church teachings, I viewed it as their problem. Since these teachings came from God, it absolved me from feeling guilt. I am transgender, so my belief gave me hope that it would go away and that I would be free from my sinful state. If I started accepting LGBTQ people more fully, I would have to rethink entire paradigms of how I thought the world and God and the church operated. It was emotionally safer to avoid this type of confusion and pain. So until we can identify what these benefits are, I think it will be difficult for much change to happen. But I think it's absolutely crucial for us to keep working to make our congregations and neighborhoods a safer place for LGBTQ people. And I honestly would love to see our pews just filled with LGBTQ members as their authentic selves. I think members would learn that they are a necessary part of our ward families, and it would also give LGBTQ youth positive examples and help reduce the shame that they feel. And in closing, I want to invite everyone here to commit to at least one way to learn more about the LGBTQ experience. This is a list of some resources of books, blogs, essays, and podcasts that highlight LGBTQ issues and voices. And this is not a comprehensive list by any means, but these were some that were helpful for me personally. And also right after this session is another session that highlights LGBTQ experiences within Mormonism. Now I'm going to turn the time over to Heather to share her experience.
Okay, thank you, Christina. That's such a great comprehensive list of resources. Very helpful. Some of those really helped me in my journey. I'm going to tell you about now. So it's May 2019. I'm sitting in fast and testimony meeting of my ward, 4th row, where our family always sat. My son and his wife were there. He didn't know the ward very well. We had moved there just after he left on his mission. He got up to bear his testimony, and as a proud mom, I was excited to hear what he had to say. His testimony was not what I expected. He talked about LGBTQ people and how much he loved them and how much we need to change as a church and be more inclusive and loving. How grateful he was to be in a family who was so inclusive. And I sat there and my heart was racing, and I kept waiting for him to say, and we trust the brethren, we trust in the Lord and in his timing. He didn't say any of that. I was mortified. I wanted to crawl under the bench. I wanted to move. I was so embarrassed, and I wanted the ward to see me as a faithful member of the church who was willing to follow its leaders and follow what I felt God's word. I came from a family that's well rooted in the gospel. Many of my ancestors are mentioned by name even in the Doctrine and Covenants. I love my heritage. I love my parents. They've served in the leadership callings. I still learn of things that they've done that I never knew about before. They're just good, kind, service-oriented people, and I'm proud to be a Thomas. The church always worked for my family growing up. We fit. Everything felt good. The church is where I felt peace and guidance and purpose. I married my husband, Matt, and found out right before we got married that his brother came out as gay. And maybe 10 years later, another brother as well. In 1998, we moved to Washington State, and there were 2 men who lived next door, John and Tom, and they immediately came out when they saw our U-Haul and started helping us move. They helped till we were done. They brought everything in. They were so kind. We invited them over for dinner to thank them. And they knew we were Mormon by the pictures on our walls and the furniture. They helped move in. We got that impression. And Matt mentioned that he had a gay brother. And John said, "Oh, that's why you're being nice to us." And it broke my heart that was his feeling about Mormons, which he was one for a while. So he knew it well. About 11 years ago, my husband, Matt, and I were on a walk, and we started talking about homosexuality in the church. Matt said, "I think maybe it might be like blacks in the priesthood." And I was shocked. I couldn't believe this man I married was saying such a thing. I recited the proclamation of the world to him, and I reminded him that it came from 15 witnesses of Jesus Christ. I shut down the conversation, and I shut it down for 10 years. He did not talk about it. We did not talk about LGBTQ issues at all. It was a taboo topic. Lucy, my youngest, was a bright, fun, energetic, excited young teenager. She loved the gospel. She was reading her scriptures all the time, praying. She went to the Magdalene Choir School in downtown Salt Lake and would walk to the temple after school and do baptisms for the dead by herself. She even handed out Books of Mormon on the playground at recess, which still makes me laugh that she did that at a Catholic school. And well, poor Catholics couldn't get away from us anymore. So one was returned, but she began to be more and more closed down, more isolated. At age 13, she told me she was scared and she wondered if she liked girls. I shut that conversation down too. I told her that she was just growing. She, not to label herself, that everything was going to be okay. I thought she would figure things out and that would go away. And in my mind, it was gone. She continued to become more isolated. She would no longer sing in front of us or play the piano or show us her drawings. She draws every day. She was born with a pencil in her hand. Nothing. She wouldn't open the door. She wouldn't crack it open for us to see a single part of her soul. And very frequently, I wondered if I would come home from work to a body because she was so silent and so afraid. But I didn't know what was going on. So in April of 2019, she came out to my husband. And although he didn't tell me what was going on, I started figuring things out and started to understand. And one night we were talking about it and we knew that we just wouldn't be able to come to terms with this together, that we couldn't unite on how to move forward. I was 100% ready to lose everything for God. I was willing to lay Isaac on the altar and do whatever was asked of me to be a righteous daughter of God. And at that moment, I thought maybe the thing I had to lose was my marriage, as I stood for truth and righteousness. And then a week later was this sacrament meeting where my son Miles kind of brought our family out in the open, where I needed to study and learn and really figure out what I believed. I thought I knew what I believed. I thought I agreed with everything that the brethren said until it was my daughter we were talking about. Then it got real. I started listening to Richard Ostler's podcast, Listen, Learn, and Love, because he was a temple worker and I felt like he was a safe person to listen to. I knew his brother Steve. He was our stake president until a month earlier. He was our home teacher even. And I love and trust that man. So I thought I could trust Richard. I started listening. I listened to Bryce and Sarah Cook, episode 116, and then 117. I listened to Eric and Liz McDonald. I looked for episodes of parents and how they dealt with it and maintained their testimony in the church. And then I listened to Bryce's essay. And all of those three things particularly threw everything on its head. I suddenly started seeing things differently. This thing that I thought would never, ever change, I could see these patterns of things that have changed, teachings in the church that have changed over the years. That was breaking down. That belief of mine was breaking down. I listening to the cook's son's story of deciding to finally date men, but that he wanted to go to the temple one more time with his family. That broke my heart. How could anyone have to make that decision of being able to be in the temple, a temple that I love and find peace and meaning in. Between that and companionship, I just didn't feel like that was right. And no one should be asked to make that decision. I also started looking at the fruits. I saw the way that the teachings had hurt my daughter and hurt so many others, and the people we have lost to suicide, and the families that have been torn apart, and all of the reasons that the current teachings are harming people and families. And then I looked at John and Tom, my good friends, who later adopted an 11-year-old foster child. And they're wonderful dads to this boy. He's a young adult now and just thriving. And I look at that and I think, and my neighbors across the street, lesbian couple, love them, best neighbors in the world, and wonderful people to be across the street from when my daughter came out. All of these fruits, I just thought, this can't be right. We don't have this right. So within 5 days, my beliefs had completely changed. And I told my husband, I said, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry that I've judged you all of these years and that I've shut down conversations and made you not feel like you could share with me. I'm so sorry, I was wrong. I judged you. I thought myself as more righteous, and I was wrong. And he sobbed. Our marriage has never been closer. It's never been more real. And I wouldn't trade that for anything. About a week later, after this talk with my husband, I went to Logan to a farewell of a family member, and I saw Miles and his wife Maddie walk in, and Miles' face was red and splotchy. He had just attended a state conference and afterwards talked to the general authority who was visiting about these issues, and was very disheartened, very upset about the things that he had heard. After the farewell, we went over to their house. It was Maddie and Miles and my daughters, Emily and Lucy. My husband was unable to be there. He was playing in the orchestra at Temple Square that morning. But I'm grateful for that chance to talk with my kids. I told them my transformation and the way that I believed now was different. I could not believe, so Lucy was sitting right next to me, and as I'm expressing how much I have learned, that all these years that I thought I was truly loving LGBTQ people, I wasn't. It wasn't the kind of love that Christ gives. And that is something that became so profound to me as I listened to stories of LGBTQ people and the experiences that they had, and the love and the spirituality and the talents and all of those things. I thought, the world is missing out. The church is missing out. And I suddenly want them to be more a part of everything, and I love them and see them more as Christ does. And I'm expressing all of this, and I see, or I feel Lucy lay her head on my shoulder and later reach her arm around me and give me a hug. For the first time in 2 years, she felt connected. She felt hope. And I thought, that's all they need. They just need hope. At the end of that discussion, Maddie had been very quiet. Miles turned to her and said, Maddie, what do you think of this? I didn't know what to think. I didn't know what she would be thinking about the things that I was saying. But she said, I think it's great. And I think everyone should just love people as Christ loves them. Little did I know that soon after their marriage, she had come out to him as bisexual. And I would find out a month later as she shared that knowledge with the world on episode 155 of this podcast, of Richard's podcast. And I'm so proud of her and of Miles. I felt a bit like Eve in the garden, where I had been spoon-fed everything that I needed to know, all of the decisions I should make and the path I should take my life. everything was easy. And then suddenly I realized I had to step out and I had to learn for myself. And I knew it was going to be hard and difficult, but I knew it was necessary. About 2 or 3 weeks later, Lucy told me that she no longer wanted to attend church. I was devastated. I wanted her to feel like she belonged. I wanted her to find purpose and meaning. I wanted our family to be together. But I let her walk away, and I prayed and I fasted and I cried and prayed some more. And I got a very strong and distinctive message, answer to my prayer. It was let her walk away. The church is not safe for her right now. And I believe that with all my heart. It made it much easier for me to support her and let her walk away. Last fall, one thing I started to recognize is that the church, the way that the teachings are, the way that LGBTQ people are talked about at church, it's very us and them kind of language. And I was always part of the us group. And I felt like I loved them and everything was okay. And we will all figure this out eventually. And then suddenly my daughter is them. And by extension, my family is them. And I could not believe the difference in the messages I was hearing and the pain and the exclusion and the hurt of things that I was hearing at church that were so painful. And church became something that I had to gear myself up for every week and would take 2 days to recover from. That then in the fall, Miles decided to have his name removed from the records of the church. A couple of months later, Emily decided she no longer believed. That was the hardest one for me, my last child, to decide to walk away. My last thread that I could claim I was a good mother in Zion. And I regret the pressure I put on her to stay. A few months after that, Miles had an experience in priesthood. He was still going to church to support Maddie, who has chosen to remain active. And his ward didn't know that he was no longer a member, but he was listening to this priesthood class and things that were being said about people who had left the church. And it was so painful to him. He raised his hand and he shared how he was feeling. And he was no longer a member. He said he was most worried about people coming up to shake his hand after because he'd been crying. His hands were covered in tears and snot. He was hurting so deeply, and listening to his story, listening to his pain hurt me because I understood. I understood the pain he was feeling. And at that moment, I thought, if at some point I agreed to go through my own faith crisis so that I could be there with my kids and my husband, I would do it 1,000 times. And suddenly I am Adam in the garden story. Eve is leaving, she can't stay. I needed to decide, am I going to hold fast and be the example to them? Am I going to put obedience over unity? Heavenly Father never would have wanted that for Adam or for Eve. And so I have stepped out of the garden. And I'm not talking about leaving the church. I'm still on a journey. I'm still figuring things out. But I am talking about leaving the safety of certainty. I want to build heaven now, and I want to be with my family. Thank you.
Heather, I love you. Christina, I love you. This is so awesome. I'm going to start the video back for everybody. So my role as a moderator today is to moderate this discussion. Chris is not here with us. And I have been asking myself, while Christina has been talking and while Heather has been talking, what can I do as a transgender woman who is a therapist, who has worked with Mormon moms of queer kids for 6 years now? What can I do to make this a more integrative conversation? So I'm actually not going to tell my story. I think that I'm going to decenter myself in this conversation. And the reason I'm doing that is because I'm looking at the title of the session, and it's titled, How Hearts Are Changed, Learning to Affirm LGBTQ Journeys. So we've just heard from two amazingly brave and courageous and vocal, visible Mormon moms of queer kids who I snap all day long for you guys. I don't have that journey of affirming others, but I can say this, that I did have to learn to affirm my own journey. And that involved coming up with the inner fortitude, the inner awareness, looking at the scales and the data. I participated in a Brian Simmons study. I use Brian's study in my work often. My journey to being a woman, trans woman who's now a therapist, began with my photograph. Coincidentally, I have a camera in the background. My journey began doing a ethnographic study of 137 Mormon moms called the Mama Dragon Story Project. I'm back here in Utah now, practicing with queer kids, trans kids, and their families. And now that I'm back in Utah, I have access to people like Heather and Christina, who I'm going to twist your arm and make you become part of my project, by the way. You better say yes. So as the moderator, I'm going to jump into some of the questions, many of which are very, very relevant. One is not, and when I get to it, I'm going to answer that question. But I'll just start with kind of a generic, kind of the first question. How do we positively support the LGBTQ community when we don't have close family or friends that are LGBTQ? It's a very private topic, but we want to help change attitudes around us. Sorry, I ended the question early. So go ahead. How do we shift and how do we support LGBTQ people if we're not personally involved?
I think speaking up and, little things like rainbow necklaces or bracelets or a flag or something. It doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't have to be a lot, but just making sure people know that you're aware. And I really believe that as you support one marginalized group, other marginalized groups also feel safe. So in the way that you speak, talk about everyone in an inclusive way. I think that's really important. And I also believe that it's really, I know some people can become critical of the way that people do that, whether if they're too outspoken or not outspoken enough. And I think it's really, really important to recognize that there is a place for everyone in that. I mean, for example, I think some people see Richard Osler as being too attached to church teachings. He was exactly what I needed. I needed that bridge to help me. So I have learned from that, for those that are way more outspoken than I am comfortable with, that they too have a place in this change of this societal shift of the way that we view LGBTQ topics and individuals.
Yeah, and I like to use social media as well to highlight stories of LGBTQ individuals. I mean, I do get pushback occasionally from people who are very unyielding to the doctrine, but more often than not, I'll get private messages from people, saying, hey, my son just came out as transgender, or my dad came out as transgender, or, I mean, it's just kind of, I just put that out there that I am a safe person, that if you want to talk about these issues going on in your family or with your loved ones, and And then I can also connect to resources. I feel pretty connected with a lot of organizations. So I personally might not know a lot about the transgender experience, but I know Nika Allgood does. You know, she's a Mormon mom. Her son Grayson is transgender, and so I have her number. And there's several other people. I just try and connect them and get them a support system where I can.
I think those are great resources, and Nika, of course, is very powerful. Another question, given how powerful personal interactions are in improving attitudes towards LGBTQ people, how can we help create opportunities for more church members, especially leaders, to have these interactions?
Pray that they'll have an LGBTQ child. I don't know. I mean, honestly, nothing else could have done it for me. But I do think that just knowing people, I think that makes a big difference when you can humanize it, when it's real. Christina?
I think that one is a tough one because it depends a lot on local leadership. So I know some wards and states that actually hold like a fifth Sunday lesson on this subject. They'll invite LGBTQ members to come speak, or there's been firesides, and I would love that. But I know it depends a lot on the area. You know, I mean, I've emailed my stake presidency a few times about it, but I don't know if they're wanting to do that now, or I don't know if there's other things they want to focus on, and I'm not trying to be critical. I just think a lot of it, like Heather says, is, you know, pray for more interactions with people. And I don't know. I think that's something I'm still trying to figure out, how to make more interactions. And I know there's an organization called Peculiar that hosts Allies and Appetizers nights. So just all around the country, they're trying to find people to invite an LGBTQ person in their home or on Zoom right now because of the pandemic, and then invite people into their home who want to learn more, and they can hear a story of an LGBTQ person. So I know there's efforts from different groups to try and bridge this gap of the us versus them, and to try and get people to hear more of the stories, because I think that is the key, is the stories. Those are crucial for people to learn to see this issue in a different light.
I'm going to agree with you, Christina. I'm also going to say, as a queer person, to be very wary about using queer people as a tool or as a pawn in your own agenda. Yeah. There are many, many people, myself included, who have been very visible and very vocal and sharing our stories. It's up to you to find us. Don't expect us to find you, because we do a lot of heavy labor, a lot of manual labor, getting our stories out there, being vulnerable, being visible. There are plenty of chances for you to find those stories and share them with your particular network. But thank you for the question.
I love that, Kimberly. Thank you.
You're welcome.
That's great.
Kind of a statement and a question. Christina, I loved your question for us. I love this question too, actually. For us to ask ourselves, how does the current church policy towards LGBT people benefit me? How could we ask that at church, but maybe in a less provocative way, to promote dialogue and introspection? Yeah, that really centers the person who's not queer, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. So is that question more, how can the church organization...
Yeah, how can we ask how can we ask that at church? Like, for example, how could I at Relief Society or at Priesthood or in Sunday school, how could I say, hey, you know, this LGBT policy really promotes my well-being. How can we shift that to promote the LGBT person's well-being? I think that's the question. How can we have those discussions at church to be less provocative and increase dialogue and introspection?
That's a great question. I mean, honestly, for leadership to acknowledge that there is a benefit, it would have to honestly break down some of the things that we have in the church right now. I mean, just gender roles, patriarchal structure. Like, I don't think those things can exist if there was absolute, like, LGBTQ equality within our church. And that's a tough one, honestly. I guess if I was a leader, and let's say there was a transgender woman in my board, I know a lot of leaders don't want the transgender woman in Relief Society because it's uncomfortable for the members. But if they start focusing maybe more on the benefits for the transgender member and not the comfort of those who are cisgender and heterosexual, I don't know. I mean, that's a start. Just try and look at it from their perspective and not center everything on the members who don't experience it.
Any thoughts, Heather?
No, I just echo what Christina's saying. That's great.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer, actually. Let's see. Question real quick. Can we get the list of resources /website/podcast posted on the chat? I think that what we'll do is in the show notes, I'll have Grace and Sunstone add that list of resources to the episode. Another question, and I'm going to answer this question. Straight sexuality has healthy and deviant sides. I presume LGBT sexuality also has this range. How can we encourage healthy and discourage unhealthy? Must we discuss the details? No, we don't discuss the details. I think a better question that you could be asking is, why are you feeling the need to label something as healthy and deviant? Why are you concerned with interjecting yourself into a question about someone else's sexuality? I think this is an external looking question, and I think there are so many things that we can do to look internally regarding our own sexuality and our own attitudes about sex, generally speaking, that until we have that grappled, don't even worry about anybody else's doing. Thank you for asking. Next question. I love this question, actually. How do you create a supportive environment in your home for preteen children still figuring out their sexual orientation identity? And I'm going to add gender identity as well. How do you best prepare /strengthen these kids against anti-LGBT rhetoric they may hear in church or among extended family?
I think it's really important to ask questions with youth. Don't tell them. Ask them, how does that make you feel? Do you think that's something Jesus would do? Or maybe read examples. I know when last summer we were doing the Come Follow Me lessons at home. This is the one thing that my daughter enjoyed during that time. It was Acts 10 that we were talking about when the gospel went to the Gentiles, and that how much that shook up the Jews, and how much that changed things. And we related that story to how things are now. So to be able to have this conversation, and she just got on fire. She was so excited that this has happened before, that other people have been excluded. And guess what? The Jews were not correct. It kind of gave her this permission to see it that way. So I don't know. I've been talking about just different people's perspectives.
Can I remind you that the first person that was converted was a eunuch of color from Ethiopia?
Yes.
By the way, just saying. Christina, answer the question.
That's a great question. I just know in my own home, I'm still trying to navigate this, but I don't place judgments on people. So I had a wedding announcement on my fridge of two men. Two of my friends were getting married, and my 7-year-old looked at the announcement and said, well, where's the woman? Are they supposed to have a woman to marry? And that was a great opportunity to have a conversation just about, some men are created to love other men and to marry them, and the same with women. And it's something that I just said matter of fact, and I didn't add anything else to that, like the church teaches this, or and as they get older, it'll be interesting. I don't know exactly how to navigate if they hear dissonance at church versus what I teach, but hopefully in the environment in their home, they're just learning, we just love them, and they're created that way, and we support them.
It's appropriate and excellent answer.
Thank you.
That's the right answer. You're passing.
Okay,
A plus for both of you. A
passed.
plus. My daughter just came out to my husband and myself as bisexual. At this point, she has expressed a desire to keep her sexual identity confidential. Good for her. Do you have advice for how I can best support her? Can I jump in real quick? Don't tell her story until she gives you permission. Okay, you guys get to answer the question now.
Absolutely. I'll echo that. And coincidentally, my daughter also came out as bisexual first. And then I think it took her maybe a month to be like, no. And she's full on lesbian now and proud. So I think she was easing us and herself into embracing her sexuality. So I think just being there, just being willing to listen. No messages of shame or exclusion. Do not use the word normal relationships when talking about heterosexual, because all relationships are normal. So that would be one piece of advice I would have.
I think I'll just add to that. I absolutely hate the phrase, love the sinner, hate the sin. I know people use this, but as my friend Travis told me when he came out, people were like, well, just don't act on it, and we love you, but we don't love your sin. And it's just very othering, and it's just, there's nothing good that comes from that phrase, in my opinion. So I don't recommend using that. Oh, I think, are you muted?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. You're good now.
Okay, I like to turn that phrase, and I like to say, hate the bigotry, but love the bigot.
That works. Or love the believer, hate the belief. I've heard
Exactly.
that too.
I want to go back up to what Heather was saying, though, that all relationships are normal. I would say that all relationships based in consent, that is continual and consistent, those relationships are normal.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Another statement, I often feel what limits Mormons from supporting LGBTQ people is not having family or friends who are LGBTQ. I agree. This leads me to feel it is a lack of empathy and humanist concern than knowledge. How can we foster more empathy and humanist concern within family and friends who may never have an LGBTQ relative? I think we kind of answered that earlier, but go ahead if you want quick. We have about 2 minutes too.
So how to get other people to gain that empathy? Is that the question?
How do we increase empathy besides taking everyone to the dog pound and having them all adopt a puppy? How do you increase empathy?
Yeah. Oh, that's good. I think it comes down to, like, the more vocal I am, the more supportive I am. I think maybe people could see that eventually, as maybe okay. Or the more leaders too. I think a lot of church members, like Heather was saying, the reason she listens to Richard's podcast is because he is a member and a bishop. Like, I don't think she would have just gone to a podcast of like a gay person and just listened. So I think it's important for members of the church to be visible somehow with their support.
I think it's really important too to just listen, and for any church leaders out there who are listening to this, just listen to people. Do not give them doctrine. Do not. Honestly, we know it, right? Do not tell them. Just live. Make sure you live all your covenants. We are going through a lot of transition and change and trying to make sense of things, and we are aware of all those words and all of those things that you're telling us. So just listen and come at it with a desire to learn and then you will be a safe place for LGBTQ individuals and families, and we need that.
That's beautiful. There actually is one question about sex education and LGBTQ and expanding that. I'm not going to ask it because I think that the way Heather ended right there is perfect. Thanks, you guys. I think I found 2 new best friends.
Oh, great.
Is that okay? Can we be friends?
Absolutely.
Okay, cool. And yes, I'm going to photograph you guys and talk to you about my things. So.
Okay.
Thanks for Heather and Christina for presenting. I'm sorry that Chris, that they couldn't make it for the session. Thank you for Heather and Christina to let me kind of jump in and pivot just slightly. I think I don't know that we really shifted things much, but I really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks to those of you who asked some really provocative questions and allowed us some good space to answer those. Again, thanks to Christina and to Heather, and thanks to Grace and Lindsay and Stephen and Trace and all the gang at Sunstone for doing a hell of a job this weekend. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank
bye-bye.
you.